All right, welcome in everyone. Jamon Moore here with Colin Etnier. Colin, it hasn't been that long since we've talked, but it's been a little bit. How are things?
Things are all right. It's finally starting to get cold here on the East Coast, and I hear the same is over on the West Coast as well. So it's winter's coming, boys.
That's right. Well, I'm up in the Pacific Northwest, so I'm feeling a little bit more of it. I felt a bit of it last year, and yeah, there's a very clean cutover here, which I appreciate. Where I grew up in Chicago, and you would just like weather's up and down all the time. You're like,
Yep.
oh, is it time for winter? Oh, wait, no, we're getting a hot day again. Here
Yep.
in the Pacific Northwest, there's like it's 70s this week, it's 40s this week. We're gonna move it back to 50 this week, but like it's the same for the entire week, and I kind of
No,
appreciate that.
either way, our native fan base in San Jose, you guys have it much better off. So don't leave where you are.
All right. Well, we appreciate everyone joining. Kind of a last second aftershock tonight. I know some people are gonna get in here as soon as they can, but Colin, we've got some information. We have now some roster decisions. It's something that I know is near and dear to your heart every year. You've spent like articles breaking down who the Quakes should keep, and I feel like in the past there were a lot of unknowns and a bit of angst around these types of decisions. It's starting to become a bit more predictable. I feel like the team is, you can kind of go like, okay, these players are likely the ones that they're not going to renew. These like ones are the problem ones they probably are. And some of those are just smart roster construction decisions. And some of those where it's very clear who's not getting played on the field. It feels like it's less stress than it used to be. Is that fair?
Absolutely. That's probably has something to do with the way that the team operates, just being a little bit more solid. But that's not. It's actually a much simpler, more prosaic factor. MLS requires quite a lot more disclosure and transactions today than it did in 2015, and in back then, both by rule, but also by culture, they weren't disclosing anything that they didn't have to. Now, when we get a new contract extension or a new player signed, it's we see not necessarily 100% of the details, but it's quite common now to give us a length of contract and even sometimes to give us the option years from the contract. That's something that just never would have happened 7 years ago. So, I obviously have now updated my salary spreadsheet. If you go back there, the first salary spreadsheet is all the way back in 2015. And in that spreadsheet, I can see that there's 4 contracts that I had any specific clarity for how long that they were.
Wow.
And of those 4, 3 of them were DPs or DP type contracts, Innocent, MPG, and Chris Wondolowski. And then one of them was Anibal Godoy, who was a midseason international transfer. The point being that you can kind of go back in history to figure out like the information levels we had then versus the information levels we had now. Totally different ball game. So this year we don't have perfect information. Sometimes we kind of cobble together what we can know, but we have a general idea of who's out of contract, a general idea of who's in an option year, and you can combine that information with what we know about who's playing for the team. Who does the coach appear to like? Who does the FO to like? Who does it make sense to hold on to? Who's getting paid too much? Who's on a good deal, etc. And so now, we end up in a situation where once this was released, very few surprises. There was to the extent that there were surprises, there were more of those kind of marginal cases where you could see them going either way, rather than those before times when it was just all a mystery.
It also feels like quite a bit of a different environment. I went back and watched a little bit of our show from last year, and it was you, myself, Asher, and Alex. Alex wasn't available tonight to join us, but there felt like a lot of more uncertainty because of the Almeida situation. But one of the things that was really clear was Chris Leach definitely made decisions to not bring back Almeida guys. I mean, other than you could argue Eric Remedi to some level, an Almeida guy, it was pretty much a clean sweep where the Almeida players were moved off the roster. This year we had, I think, more decisions based upon kind of how they performed under Alex Cavello, what they look toward, what that probably means in a very similar style of play that we can expect, I think, from Luchi Gonzalez. In year 2, of these moves from Chris Leach, do you feel that, he has gotten now to the point where the roster is definitely constructed in the way that he wants it to be?
No, but it's all the deck clearing that needs to be done before he starts building towards the roster that he wants. That phase is now done in his second off season. I actually was wondering. I know
There was some
Jamon,
carryover of contracts last year, right, where
yeah,
he probably wanted to clear some things, but contractually was not allowed to clear some things. Is that a fair
sure,
assessment?
and also remember, Matias Almeida was still the head coach last offseason.
Right.
And so there were certain players that were Matias's guys, and Matias, as part of his kind of cultural beliefs in having a group and that kind of loyalty and solidarity, part of that is honestly they handed out contracts to some people who would not have otherwise gotten extensions or contracts at all or acquisitions at all. Some ones that I didn't know about until later on, for example, is that Gilbert Fuentes actually got an extension during his time with the club because he was there under Almeida, and Almeida saw him as part of the group. Certainly, Matt Persano was always part of the group. Daniel Vega was always part of the group, etc. That group that was together, that none of those guys were going to get moved on, without a real battle before Almeida had left. So a lot of Almeida's guys got cleared out last year. Leach won the argument on a few of them, but now there's no one to kind of push back against it. And that's why we see the remainder of the clearing. And I was actually wondering, Jamon, I know you have a graphic on this. If we could throw it up for the people on the screen, just so that in case people do not have the press release in front of them, tell me if I'm premature in that. Okay.
No, let's go ahead and start to get into this. I think one of the things that I wanted to kind of mention off the bat here is there was something I was able to get some information on. I know in previous years, and I think this is a change from the way Fiorinelli structured contracts to the way Chris Leach is structuring contracts. Because one of the things we know Chris Leach wanted was for when the new coach came in after Almeida, whoever that was going to be. And of course, when I talked to him, last year about this, he was purposefully vague, I think, because the Almeida situation was, still in place. Like Matias Almeida was still the coach. The team had not yet gone through its losing streak, and thereby, it wasn't clear, exactly what was going to happen to Almeida. But he did say that, he had been restructuring contracts so that he had the maximum flexibility after the season was done. And I believe with a look toward the next contract. So of the options exercised in the past, over the last 2 to 3 years, some of those auto executed, meaning that the contracts had reached a particular threshold, either in playing time or in production, that automatically triggered the options. And so those players automatically got options exercised. But if you looked at the press release, you wouldn't know the difference between them. This time, I know for sure, these options were exercised, not because they reached certain triggers, but because this was what the club decided to exercise. And I think that is a break from the norms of the past. And I wanted to kind of lead with that information because the first column here being options exercised, I think we're looking at, a lot of young players here. Paul Marie, the one that you would consider to be almost a veteran at this point. What are your thoughts in terms of the ones that were exercised?
Yeah, I mean, what you see in the ones who are being brought back are all young players to a certain extent. Paul Marie is a prime age player. Jack Scan actually secretly is a prime age player, even though, he's because he did 4 years in college and he's now had 2 in the league. So he's actually kind of getting into that prime age. Will Richmond and Oxford Agran, also college players who spent significant time in college and then came. So they're younger players and they're less experienced players, but these are not like the super young prospects that we're seeing come through the homegrown pipeline, for example. So all of these guys, I think, actually are older than Benji Kikanovic, as an example. So what you're seeing, though, these are none of these guys are the big money guys. All of them are on relatively small salaries. All of them, except Paul Marie, can situate on the non-senior rosters. So this is they were very careful about who they brought back. They brought back a pretty limited group. Of this group, By the way, an option, not in every instance, but in many instances, an option indicates the last year of a contract. There are some contracts that are structured to be longer. Will Richmond, for example, has rolling options, so the team can kind of continually exercise his options. But for a lot of other contracts, the option year is the last year. So for all these guys on a relatively small budget charge, most of them not hitting the senior roster, it's pretty low lift for the team, pretty low liability for the team to bring them back. And they're young enough that there's a possibility they could take one step further in their development. And if Jack Skane becomes a legitimate backup right back, because it seemed like they were sort of pushing him towards that position at the end of the year, maybe it's worth it to bring him back on a minimum. Will Richmond, maybe he kind of emerges into something. Oscar Agren could be part of, he could be a second choice center back. If he escalates to that level, it's worth bringing him back, and it's pretty low effort. But either way, the thing that stands out is none of these are big ticket items. All the big ticket items are in the other two columns.
Yeah, Jack Skane, for my part, in kind of the secondary competitions, and when you think Leagues Cup is going to be happening again this year, like that's where he really kind of stood out. He had a really great U.S. Open Cup run. Really kind of supporting the team and giving rest to some players there in central midfield. But to your point, he does have some flexibility. We've also seen from him, he can score goals. He's got a good ability to take a free kick. So there's a little bit more with him. I think like from a set piece perspective, there's more there than he's been able to show so far. I'm very interested to know a little bit more about maybe what they're seeing also in training that we're not yet seeing on the pitch from that perspective. The one that's a little bit different here, I'd like to get your feedback on. You mentioned Will Richmond is in kind of a rolling option contract, and he is a homegrown. So that also gives him the ability to be in a special part of the roster for homegrowns. It seems a little different for him, for a homegrown, to be on that kind of rolling option agreement. Is that because you think of his age, having gone through college, or do you think that's a little bit more like they're less sure about his development at this point?
Yeah, I'm less sure about the development, I think, is the real answer. I mean, we mentioned this before. In the last time that we got together for this show, we were talking about Benji Kikanovic's contract and where the club goes from here. Mm-hmm. It's just important to remind everybody, a contract, with a contract you don't get what you deserve, meaning you don't get paid per unit of production. What you get is you get whatever you have the leverage to negotiate. And when you are a Sacramento State college kid who is decently well thought of but doesn't have super huge national profile, and you're signing through a waiver mechanism, you don't necessarily have the leverage to offer or to demand a huge guaranteed contract. If you're Cade Cowell and you're moving in from Central Valley to come over to the Quakes Academy to sign a pro deal, you have a little bit more leverage to do that. Will Richmond goes to Stanford, goes through the college system. He probably would not have been a top of the MLS draft pick. He doesn't therefore have a huge amount of leverage, and therefore the club is going to structure a deal that allows them to, keep him if he does develop, but let him go if he doesn't. And so what this is showing is that they have enough faith in his development after 1 year to see a second year. And that's an encouraging sign, but none of these four really should be major players except for Paul Marie. But even he has been kind of supplanted in the right back pecking order by Carlos Acapo. And then on the other side, Trauco as well. So, the other ones for me are all developmental. I mean, it would be nice to have a fourth center back, but these are, medium young players who they're hoping get kind of one notch better in this contract year. And by the way, so and Jamon, you're on mute. Yeah.
Of the two, if we draw a correlation between Paul Marie and Tommy Thompson and kind of how things are now with these two outside backs coming in, it feels like for a production for money, Paul Marie, if you have to make a decision, is the one to exercise. But as I reported, the sources within the club are indicating that they are looking to try to bring back Tommy Thompson and also Judson. So we'll get to that here in just a little bit, but did it surprise you? Anything on this options declined list? Did it catch you by surprise?
I think there's two worth discussing. Tommy Thompson is an obvious decline for me. not in the sense that I dislike him as a player or want him out of the club, but he was on close to 300,000 a year, which is a pretty sizable contract for someone who at this point might be your third choice right back. And again, back to the earlier point about Jack Skane, it seems like the club might be at least considering him at that role as well. And that means he's not an essential player. And if he's not a potential rotation, top 2 player at any individual position, you can't pay him 300 grand a year. So with Tommy, I imagine they want to keep him in the club. Great club servant. He is a useful MLS player, but they'll probably try to get him at a lower number. Bersano, I was surprised by just because he comes at a relatively low number. He's well loved in the club, and there isn't a different option out there right now that's just like an obvious and immediate option. I should note, of course, that backup goalkeepers in MLS, it's generally a position that clubs don't like spending a lot of money on, and they don't like using international slots on. So when you have a cheap domestic player who fits in really well with the group, it kind of surprised me that they didn't take up that option. Even if they were intending to replace him with a second choice, later on, it would, give you some cover until then. So what it tells me is that they probably have a plan in mind for how to fill that spot. Or they intend to, upgrade Emi Ochoa to a second place role, but I would be very surprised if they were ready to do that at this point. Jamie, if you want to go in there.
Yeah, they did bring in, a new goalkeeper coach.
Yeah.
As well. At least, that's been reported by, first to it was our Alex Morgan reporting that the Earthquakes were making a move for the Chicago Fire goalkeeper coach. Whose name just all of a sudden slipped my mind, unless you know it.
Likewise.
Okay. And then, but at this end, then was basically confirmed by Tommy Scoops the other day. That I think gives us a pretty good sense that they're getting pretty serious about the goalkeeper position at this point. And I think one of the interesting things to me, at least, and we can get into this when we get into the goalkeeper list, because we'll look at that on the next slide. But, my question is, do they believe that JT is the goalkeeper going forward, or do they feel like he needs to get pushed? So by bringing in a higher profile goalkeeper coach, obviously, who's going to help Emi, hopefully in the same way that he helped Gaga Slonina.
Yeah.
Is there also the possibility that they may look at JT and go like, we're getting good production. We could get better production out of the position, and maybe we're going to bring in somebody to compete with him. I'm not saying an international player, but that wouldn't shock me to go outside the league and really bring in someone that they think could compete with JT, really push JT. And let's try to find out over the next year or two if JT is the guy or not, and maybe have an option to see if you can get better production out of the position. I would say at the moment, it's more like average production within the league, maybe slightly above average.
I think that's a possibility. I think it would probably be a bit misplaced if they thought that what JT really needed was competition. I think that goalkeepers like having solidity and confidence and consistency. And, my diagnosis of the team's errors last year was, everything happening in front of JT much more than him. That's not to say he's necessarily a top drawer MLS keeper. I just think that we don't know one way or another at this point. So I think that the two fixes are fix what's in front of him. And then if you're bringing in a new coach that you really have some faith in, that coach could bring the best out of him as well. So I wouldn't be surprised, though, if they did go out for at least a solid veteran backup rather than let Emi be the number 2. I think
keepers often get better with age.
Yeah.
And
so Bersano was slightly surprising to me. It's not the end of the world necessarily. Tommy's not surprising because of the price point. George Asamani never really.
What would you like Tommy back on? Let's put it at a price
150.
Point okay, I was thinking 175. About half. So I think we're in a similar boat.
Gilbert Fuentes sneakily was on 200 grand last year. Jan Gregush was 650. And he's a quality player, and especially on the ball. He was actually one of the. You can tell, that he's one of the highest quality players on the team when he's on the ball. Everything else isn't necessarily enough to compensate for it, and it can be difficult tactically to scheme around a player like that. So when you have a 30-something player who's on 650 grand a year, who's a bit of a luxury player, that's an easy castaway right there. And then Saeed Haji, there's very dear to my heart. I loved watching him play. I loved his talent and his potential. He just never really got there. And, that therefore makes a lot of sense to me to let him go at this point. I hope he catches on at a lower league club where he can kind of develop his game and develop into something. Because his kind of vision and technical ability was very cool to watch. Look, he might end up being like Lindo Mfeka, who's made a very nice career for himself in USL as a technical player with some vision, but doesn't quite have the all-around game to make it at the next level. And then the out of contracts make sense as well. Judson was on a fairly reasonable contract, as was Remedi, but they were still decent size. They're in the 450 zone to 500, and that's an amount you want to pay a starting level player. And Judson, at one point in his career, was much more valuable than that. At 2021 and 2022, he's a little bit less valuable than that. So they're going to probably try to bring him back on something less. And Eric Remedi, it seems like that's a clean break. So no surprises for me, really across the board. And by the way, I noticed in the comments they mentioned this doesn't seem like a lot of money, or how much money we save. What you're seeing right here, that's $2.6 million coming off the books. If you really add all these things up. Now, $2.6 million does not necessarily mean $2.6 million of cap space. This is an important distinction because, first of all, some of these players didn't hit the cap in the first place. Like Syed Haji was part of the Generation Adidas program, doesn't hit the cap. Gilbert Fuentes is on a homegrown contract, doesn't hit the cap. But it comes out of the club's, kind of ownership budget rather than their cap budget. And then on cap dollars, something that somebody at the club actually pointed out to me that I'd like to clarify, because I actually didn't really appreciate this. There's a couple of things that kind of crimp your spending when you're taking these dollars off. So, for example, bonuses earned in the previous year, they actually come against the subsequent year's cap charge. So if you earned a bonus by score, like let's say Jeremy Bobasi gets a bonus for scoring 15 goals, which I'm sure he did, that doesn't come off the 2022 budget. It comes off the 2023 budget.
Very interesting.
Anyway, what I've been told is that that's the 2.6 number that I've estimated is perhaps a bit high compared to what you're actually going to see come off the cap. But you're going to see something over 2 million or a little over 2 million come off the cap, or out of mechanisms like TAM that effectively function like a cap just for a particular class of players. So the point is, that's a decent amount of money. It's not a huge amount of money. It's not a world-changing amount of money, but that's absolutely a couple starting level players can go into that. And obviously the big money spending comes in those TAM players and those DPs, but this kind of allows some maneuvering for Lucci to come in and they can get some stuff done.
Regarding the bonuses, it would seem like year over year, there's probably a budget that is set aside for expected bonuses.
Yeah.
And that some years it's going to get fully triggered and some years it's not, right? And so probably there's plans around that type of thing. Okay, good. The fans are starting to ask some questions, and I do want to get to a few of these, and then we'll get to, there's another slide we want to get to. And then we're going to dive into the salary spreadsheet a little bit here. But I think, we've got some good comments. Emmanuel says that all the hardcore fans are asking for is a competitive team. It's been far too long. And I think, again, these are steps toward clearing the space to be able to get the players that are needed to be able to field that competitive team. So I think Satish is asking, what kind of budget will the Quakes have to sign new players now? You mentioned there's a difference here between cap budget space and actual budget space. Can you talk a little bit? Do you have a good sense, from your spreadsheet and your calculations and the new MLSPA numbers that came out, what the difference is between the two at the end of the season before all these things happened?
Yeah. So the big caveat on all of this is that for both the reasons that I described before, as in there are things that are going on these cap charges that we never really get pure visibility on. 1, 2, the MLSPA salary release is mostly accurate and very helpful, but it's not perfectly accurate. So we don't necessarily have the right budget charges. Transfer fees, if they are paid for non-designated players, go into the cap charge in a way that we can't necessarily account for because we don't necessarily know the hard dollar amount. GAM transactions, we can see some of them, but we don't see all of them, and we don't see the number of allocations there are. So basically, there's a lot of different mechanisms that make it hard to give a very precise accounting for how much space there was. I personally, my spreadsheet implied that there was like $1.6 million in space, as it were, between a formal hard cap GAM and then those TAM players, which, as I said, effectively functions like a salary cap for a specific bracket of player. That grouping together, I thought we had about 1.5-ish million going into this offseason. I was told by the club that is a way overestimate, so it was much closer than that. This here is going to add maybe about 2 million in flexibility. So I think that we should work from the assumption that somewhere between 2 and 3 million of those cap plus TAM dollars are out there to be used, and they will use them. There's really not a huge amount of benefit for the club to not use those kind of on cap dollars. The bigger questions about, like, is ownership spending enough? Well, that really kind of goes more to those players that are doing, that are in the DP spectrum. That's where you really start racking up those charges. And the other thing I would mention is those big vats of GAM that you get by selling players. That's one of the reasons that certain clubs have been able to escalate their salary structure to spend more of those kind of on cap dollars through GAM. That the Quakes really just don't have, because they have not been selling a huge number of players abroad the way that certain other clubs have. So FC Dallas just has this huge padding of GAM that they can use both for trades, but they can also use it to expand their salary cap. So the Quakes are actually kind of working on a slightly lower hard cap, as it were, than certain other clubs. So I think that that's one of the things that they want to start doing, so as they can have a larger kind of every day, not the top 3 players, but players 4 through 15, to spend more on that grouping. They want to be selling players on to kind of buttress that amount. But anyway, my point is 2 to 3 million would be my guess.
Marcos Lopez, Francisco Calvo, are getting the Quakes started in that direction for the very first time, to be quite honest.
Yep, absolutely. And you won't see the dramatic effects until you get a big sale, and that could be Benji Kikanovic. It certainly could be Cade Cowell. Who knows?
I think there's a couple other things I want to kind of point out here too. One is that we make a lot of noise about the difference between the Quakes spending and other teams in the league. But to be quite honest, they're within $1 million of several teams and 2 million of other teams. And a lot of that has to do with the differences in the designated player expenditures. So if the Quakes' top designated player right now is Jumiro Montero, and Montero is on a 2 million or whatever a year.
Well, it's like a 1.5-ish.
1.5. Let's say 1.5 then. Let's use that number. But then the next team up decides that they're going to spend 3 million on the same designated player spot. Well, now all of a sudden it's going to look like there's 1.5 difference just because of the expenditure. Doesn't actually mean that necessarily the player is better performing or anything like that. But when you compare it, to the rest of the league, and I think that's what we're seeing right now, is other teams are beginning to spend more in their designated player slots, and the Quakes, at least not yet. But I think this is, again, moves that they are trying to get closer to. And one of the things that was posted recently in a big soccer forum from somebody who had interviewed for a position within the team, I believe it was for a video analyst position. One of the things that they came out with and said is that, it does appear that the team is, as Lucci has said in his press conference, they are willing to start to make some more expenditures. I think the thing is, they didn't want to do that with Matias Almeida because they knew he was a lame duck last year. In fact, we mentioned that on our show last year and pretty much were proven correct. And that, if you're going to make that kind of move in either year 1 or year 2 of a coach like Lucci Gonzalez, that's the time where you would want to make it to have the best effect. Usually a new coach in the league, their best year is going to be, and he's not new in the league, but a new coach to a team like this that's definitely considered to be a long-term hire, their best year is going to be year 2. So the question is, what do they realistically think they can accomplish in year 1? What is the right expenditure to go with that? And then do they want to, save anything for year 2 for something bigger after they can fully evaluate year 1 with Lucci? The question is, are they going to make that splash right away, or will they hold back a little bit toward that? And I think that's the tension point that we don't really know answers to right now.
And the opportunism could be the winter window post World Cup. I mean, I've certainly heard that clubs are not talking to each other the same way first of all, MLS's transaction windows are a little bit unusual because it's our off season right now. It's nobody else's off season. Most of those other windows don't start until January. But then the unusual winter World Cup this year, World Cups are traditionally times that clubs basically stop talking about transfers, or they put off any kind of finalizing kind of talks because they want to know if If it's not even necessarily a player who's at the World Cup, but imagine that you're looking at a player who's in the World Cup. Maybe his price goes up and prices you out of a move, so you hold on to your own player who isn't in the World Cup, who you would have been able to replace otherwise. So it kind of becomes like a cascading effect of kind of held deals. So I think that the club certainly is going to be waiting until after the World Cup to do major business, but it's possible the winter window isn't fruitful and they wait to the summer window. So at the very least, waiting 6 months. If not, then they could be waiting a full year until that year too. But yes, Jamon's right. The most of the salary differentiation is due to the designated player spot spending. And again, the only thing that is published is their salaries rather than their transaction fees. So it's not always easy to compare apples to apples. And then the rest of the spending disparity, as I mentioned before, is for those clubs that have sold lots of players, they actually have enough GAM to expand their kind of the rank and file of their roster at a greater rate than San Jose can. So I actually think that San Jose is rank and file. They're spending basically what everybody else is spending. Right. Their DPs is not huge.
In fact, I would say that they're spending more in the TAM position than a lot of teams are, actually.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Although effectively, that's kind of use it or lose it, and it would be silly not to, in my personal opinion. And then in terms of front office spending, because I've seen a comment to that effect as well from a couple minutes ago. They hired 3 analytics people. That's one of the largest, if not the largest, department in the league right now. They're making these investments. So the one thing that I want everybody to keep in mind for these investments is for those on cap dollars, the things that are either hard cap, GAM, or TAM. The front office uses what they have. It is set by the league, and the transactions that have preceded it is what they have. So that's not really ownership telling them one way or another. Ownership could be telling them to kind of cut spending on TAM players, perhaps to save a little money, but that's not a huge amount. Where the ownership really has to weigh in is on those designated players. And in those, it's not like they just say, hey, Chris Leach, you have a budget of $3 million, go spend it however you want. Instead, what it is Chris Leach will go to ownership and say, hey, I have a $3 million player. I think he's really good. I think he's worth it, and tries to get ownership to sign on. So what I'm saying is, a couple of years ago when Carlos Vela was available to MLS, the San Jose Earthquakes held up their hand and they said, we'll take him and we'll pay him whatever the market rate is, because he would have been worth it to the club. But obviously that didn't work out. He had his own situation that he was seeking, and LAFC, lived happily there ever after. My point is, John Fisher will absolutely spend if he's convinced that it is a good spending to do, but it's more of a case-by-case thing with a designated player. Leach has to convince him that there's a $3 million player that he wants to go get. It is not just like a set budget where he can use it however he wants.
I can confirm. My sources within the team have said exactly what you're saying, Colin, that it is not like how much money is Leach going to get from Fisher. It is more how much Leach going to get from Fisher, but how much Leach can make a case that a player is worth that expenditure to Fisher, and how much trust Leach currently has. And I think with some of these decisions, I do believe that trust is being gained, more so than his predecessors. How much, we'll find out. Okay. David's got a good question here. Quakes 2 players will be signed to the first team. So let me just point one thing out here, which is that of the options declined, let's see, correct me if I'm wrong, Bersano, Asamani, Fuentes, and Haji would all be considered supplemental roster players, correct?
Yep.
So given that, how much do you think would be like, let's sign players out of the draft versus players we've already seen in Quakes 2? Do you think we see a couple Quakes 2 players promoted?
It's possible. I don't know the Quakes 2 roster well. I would say it is possible. I will say that the gap between the Quakes 2 and Quakes 1 is still relatively large. I think in sophisticated leagues that have really well-developed reserve programs, they kind of get a little bit closer to that level. I don't know if it's quite there. And I know that the Quakes really, what they're concerned about is what's going on the top end of their roster. And they actually have okay depth mostly, with one exception we'll get to in a second. But I think that there is a pretty big gap there. So I don't think it would necessarily be a huge solution, but there may be 1 or 2 players that they look to fill certain roles. As for the draft, though, and even as for everything else, I know this front office has a pretty good track record when it comes to amateur scouting within the United States, and trusts itself. So they trust themselves in the draft. They trust themselves to pick up undrafted college kids like Benji Kikanovic. They trust themselves to do that type of scouting, including in homegrowns in the region, not just in in the backyard that are already a member of the academy. So I think they put faith in themselves to kind of bring it from any possibility. There's certainly space on the roster to accommodate one or two. The question is, do they think anybody is ready to step up that level?
So, RP's comment here, Arfson and Rudy have the best chance in his opinion. I think those are two fine names. They're as good as any on the roster if you're going to pick out a couple. Do we know what happened with Fuentes? I'm just going to say that we're not going to be able to provide the details on a show like this about what happened there, but let's suffice it to say that there became a unresolvable conflict between Fuentes and the team, and that was known early last season. And as a result of that conflict, I think we were pretty certain that he was going to be leaving the club, and I think this is confirmed that was the case. There's some love here. Happy Jack Skane is staying, a very positive player. I had an interview with him. I have to say I'm super impressed with him personally. He's got a great head on his shoulders. I believe he's a leader. I would like to see him get more playing time, but obviously the team believes in him enough to have exercised his option. So good for him. Also, Marie seems like he's really improved. Have to agree with that comment again. I think in making a decision between Marie and Thompson, if that's what it came down to, I think the right decision was Marie. And if you can keep Tommy, I think that's great. More love for Skane here. Why is Bersano out? Seems like good value as a backup keeper. I think you addressed that, Colin. Any more you want to say on Bersano?
No, I wouldn't be entirely surprised if he came back in some way, shape, or form. But hopefully gets a shot, maybe in USL, to be starting week in, week out.
Yeah, Romero says that he wants to start, so maybe some inside information that David's got there. Time to bring Emmy up. Are they eyeing another backup keeper? Why don't we hold that for the next slide, and we can talk a little bit more about that. I just don't think Emmy's quite ready to play with number 2, but I also think that that's why they brought in who they brought in, is maybe to get him into that spot within another season.
We actually,
needs
by
to
the
play,
way,
and he'll get some time with Quakes too, obviously.
I was going to say, we have not talked about the change in coaching staff either, because the coaching staff wasn't announced the last time that we spoke. If you want to briefly at least talk about that, you're well positioned.
Yeah, Tom Bogert. Let me just pull up the Tom Bogert.
And by the way, to the chat,
let me find that real quick.
I was going to say, to the chat, I didn't even realize we had this capability. We can do screen sharing, so we're going to be popping up the spreadsheet as an actual screen share, like all the Zoom calls that we've been on here. So it'll be a very exciting time. Hopefully, Jamie can do the same with Tom Bogert's tweet.
I won't be able to do it very quickly, but I can. It's not that long.
Fair enough. Then I will.
I'm just going to scroll here and try to find it.
I will mention briefly that we know the rough shape of the team. The assistants.
I just want to make sure I get the goalkeeper coach correct.
Sure. So we know that the Ian Russell and Steve Ralston, who are both first of all longtime MLS players in their own right, deep connections to the club. Both of them have been assistant coaches at the club for a long time. And obviously, Ian Russell famously was the head coach of the USL affiliate Reno 1868. Will both be assistants on Lucci's staff. So he clearly was opting for club familiarity. And Ian Russell is a coach who I think a lot of fans, including myself, would have been perfectly happy as the head coach. So the fact that they get him basically as a deputy to Lucci is a huge benefit. You also get Steve Ralston, who is a super long time MLS vet, been with the club for a long time, been an assistant with the club. I think it's got to be about 7 years now. These are guys who have deep roots in the league and in the club. This is what the organization is going for. I love both of them on the staff. And I think the other two are slightly more interesting. So Jamin, if it's up to you.
Yeah, Luciano Fusco. So one of the things that I heard about Luciano, which surprised me, is that he kind of became the practice coach under Cavello last season. And I think he impressed. I've heard very good things about him from people within the club. They definitely wanted to try to keep him in a position where he could have an effect. And I will say that it's my understanding that these are selections by Lucci himself. So you might go like, well, hey, Ralston, Fusco, Russell. I mean, it doesn't look like, he brought any of his guys. Lucci didn't bring any of his guys. But I will say that my understanding is that Lucci spent a good amount of time with each person and considering who he wanted for the staff. He also brought in Aiden Brown, that's the name, is the goalkeeper coach coming in from Chicago. One of the two goalkeeper coaches, I would say, that had a big impact on Gaga Salina and the ability to be able to move him out of Chicago for good money last year. I'm sure the reason to bring him in is to help him develop Emmy, as well as help JT. But really, I think because he's been a development coach along with their academy coach, and I don't know the situation there, if Aiden's bringing along the same academy coach that also he had in the Fire program. I don't have those details, but it wouldn't shock me if he did, because between the two of them, they're the ones who really kind of worked with Gago Salina there. So.
Yeah, so the staff is strong, and I think that one thing we should mention, and this is something that Jim and you've talked about before, is that Matias Almeida was very reliant on his staff, and that's not an insult, by the way, for a head coach. A good head coach is kind of a CEO of an operation. He's not doing everything, in every role. The best coaches are the ones who have the right people in place to kind of do every sub role. And when Matias Almeida lost his right hand man, that dramatically affected his efficacy as a coach, at least from the outside. I think a lot of people felt that. And so hopefully Lucci here, and I know he has at least some relationship with Steve Ralston from the brief time that they played together in MLS, that hopefully that he can be a trusted servant. And I think that Ian is a really high quality number 2 for the league.
Yeah, I believe Ian is going to be the number 2, but I could see either him or Ralston being the official number 2. A lot of people don't know this, but there is something within the team called the first assistant and the second assistant. And, for instance, Javier Lopez, when Ian was at Toronto, Javier Lopez was the first assistant, Ian was the second assistant. And when, there was a vacancy in the head coach because the coach was let go, Javier became the coach because he was the first assistant. And usually who's in that first assistant slot, if the head coach is terminated, tends to become the interim coach in most clubs. So I'll be honest, I don't know between the two of them, Ian and Steve Ralston, which one will be considered first assistant. But I could see either one of them because both of them have at this point a lot of experience in the league. Okay. Let's see.
Jamin, if I may be annoying here, the next slide you have is basically it's the list of the remaining people less the options here, so we can focus on this for a second. Yeah. But I actually have some semi version of this on the spreadsheet as well. So I'm happy to
use the spreadsheet version instead.
Yeah.
All right, so I wanted to kind of have us have something where everyone can kind of hopefully read that.
Yeah, hopefully you can ruminate on this, everyone. Unless
you're watching us on your little phone or whatever, and maybe you're gonna be like,
by the way, wait, Jamie, this does not include the options.
Not include the options that were picked up. These are just the guaranteed contracts according to the press release. So
got it.
Okay, all right. So Tommy, what else can Tommy bring us? 9 years. I think we saw his ceiling. I think that's the reason for the renegotiation, Colin, here is that, as you mentioned, the number here is a bit higher than you would like for the type of value that Tommy Thompson has been bringing on the field. There's certainly a big value to Tommy Thompson off the field as well, such as, and someone, hopefully is going to fill in that kind of Shea Salinas type role to be like that ambassador for the club. And Tommy has done quite a bit of that over the last few years as well. So how much of it do you think, Tommy's off-field value adds to the way that they would negotiate with him?
Yeah, I mean, if it's a relatively minor contract, they have a lot of roster space. You'll see it in a second. There's a ton of senior roster spots open. He's a domestic player. If they can get him on 150 a year or whatever that, roughly that would be, that's worth having just a good head in the locker room, kind of at that level. And you'll see a lot of teams in all sports, are very happy to keep on somebody who maybe is not super, super high value on the field, but kind of adds those other things. Udonis Haslem for the Miami Heat is a very famous example for that. And Andre Iguodala for the Golden State Warriors as well.
Okay, we're going to take a few more questions here in a bit, but Colin, I'm going to turn it over to you to take us through what's going on in the in the spreadsheet and salary here?
So first of all, I'm delighted this works. I'm sure that most of the people on the mobile here are not going to be able to see it, so I apologize. I will try to talk through anything that I'm highlighting here on this spreadsheet, but this is, of course, my famous spreadsheet. You can access it on quakesepicenter.com. It is one of the links at the top. It has my best guesses and best available information on rosters. That does not mean it's gospel for all the reasons we discussed earlier. Though, as I mentioned, if you look down here, these tabs down at the bottom, you can see it goes all the way back down to 2015, and you can see the amount of information that we had at the time. And you also go walk through memory lane and remember guys like Leandro Barrera, Cordell Cato, guys you probably haven't thought about in a couple of years. But anyway, moving back over here, we now have a 23 salaries tab. This is what we're focused on here because this is where we can kind of factor in what we know about the options and declines. So this roster reflects basically the roster as currently constructed. This does not include Tommy Thompson and Judson, who they're apparently working on contracts for. These are just people who are currently contracted to the club. So what you see, first of all, is this first grouping here are senior players, and all of these red slots are empty senior slots. So if you count them out here, I believe there's 8. Yeah, there's 8 empty slots on the senior roster. You see 1 empty slot on the supplemental roster. I will say that it is easier to make space on this supplemental roster for about 1 million different reasons. So I wouldn't worry about, their ability to sneak somebody in. So Cruz Medina, for example, very young player. He's not even going to be 17 years old by August 1st, which is kind of my age date that I always use. He could easily just not be rostered, for example, and sit with Quakes too. So they can create space as they need. But 8 senior roster slots means there's a lot of guys they can sign. And I always keep here the cap plus GAM plus TAM number, which is basically the dollars that hit the cap in a way that they would have to be accounted for by one of these mechanisms. So basically, senior guys, not DPs. The cap of these 3 things together in 2023 is estimated to be 9.83 million. Currently, you see 5.5 million. As I said, I know that looks like it's a $4 million delta. I believe it's a little under 3 million because of all those things that we can't necessarily account for. I also have the total salaries number. It's 8.1 right now. As you'll note, last year it was 10.7. So there's about 2.6 off of their total spending of last year. I think they will easily add that back. You can also see the difference between cap charges and the total comp. So for the 2 designated players, they only hit the budget at that charge. And for Cade Cowell as a part of the U22 program at that charge. A lot of other information here, including ages. I just want to note that these ages here are the mean and median ages for all players and for senior players. And the thing that's interesting is it's almost, and by the way, this is all aged forward 1 year compared to last year. This is almost the exact same set of numbers that we had last year. So they basically effectively got younger by ditching some of their older players on aggregate. The only last thing I want to mention is about the international spots. The options and declines didn't get rid of many non-domestic players. They didn't actually save that many slots. And I currently have 7 slots out of 8 are currently utilized. I think it's possible that there's a couple of routes for them to open up further slots. Jamiro Montero has been in this country for a long time now and probably is potentially eligible. Useni Buddha and Oscar Agran are both players who went to college in the United States and therefore have a bit of tenure as well. So those are 3 options that I could see, but that will be much more constricted than it was last year when they had a very, very favorable situation for that.
With free agency opening tomorrow, Colin, does that mean that, in your opinion, we could see the Quakes, pretty active in a free agency perspective to be able to bring in players from within the league?
They easily could be. They would really have to find somebody they liked. The problem with free agency, and this is exactly why players want it, is it means you kind of have to pay the market value. And the market value on the free market is usually much higher than if you can acquire them through other mechanisms, i.e. a trade or through the draft, the homegrown or whatever. That's where you get the best deals. Free agency, you have to pay up for the talent. So they would have to have somebody that they really like and historically have never really dipped into that pool or similar pools to that. They did really well on the free transfers with Akapo coming in and Trauco coming in from abroad, but that's kind of a different situation. With those domestic players, you're probably going to be paying top dollar. And they're generally older because of the way that the free agent rules work. So yes, very possible, but it would be kind of a deviation from the normal strategy.
We also have the re-entry draft coming up. Do you want to talk a little bit About how the reentry draft works? Do you remember off the top of your head?
Yeah. So there's two phases. One, the first stage is basically for guys whose options were declined or who are not eligible for free agency. If you pick them in the first round of the reentry draft, you basically acquire whatever that declined option was, or that the existing salary prior to their eligibility
So
for
you
free
pay
agency.
full price for the option in effect.
Yeah, basically. So some other team says it's not worth, to pay, for example, Jan Gregush 650 grand a year. Another team says, I'll happily spend that. So they pick him up, they take that 1 year option. If the player is not picked in that first stage, they go into a second stage reentry draft, and that is when you can basically raise your hand and say, "I'd love to sign Jan Gregush, but not at the price of his option, or not with the structure of his option. I want to negotiate a separate new contract with him," and then you can do that there. The Quakes have not done this, I don't believe, since Marvell Wynn in 2016, who was very helpful for them. But it's been a while since they've really leaned into that mechanism.
Yeah, and in the second reentry draft, I believe you have like a deadline in order to be able to make an offer. You have to make an offer,
Yeah,
but you can negotiate that for a period of time,
correct.
and get a player that way.
So yeah, it would be another thing. I'd be surprised because remember, if they're in the reentry process, it's because some other team decided that they did not want to pay them the amount that they're on. So it's pretty rare. There's usually only one or two a year where it makes a lot of sense to happen. So if the Quakes, by the way, the Quakes have a nice spot in all these drafts. I think that they're fourth, maybe fifth in all these draft orders. So they have a relatively high slot. So if they find somebody they really like, they have a shot at them. But it's pretty. I would be surprised if they had any meaningful reentry draft guys. Maybe like a backup goalkeeper or something. But I would be surprised if there was a big name. And then the free agency thing, as I said, it's very possible, but it's unlikely.
Okay. Questions. Brian said, join late, so sorry if this has been addressed, but do we know how much these decisions are driven by CL and how much by Lucci? I like to start to call him Leachy.
Leachy.
We got Lucci and Leach, so it's Leachy. Anyway, I think that these are mutual decisions. I really do, and there's good reasons to think that that's the case. But it does feel that despite the upcoming World Cup, Lucci has been, in contact with the club on a very regular basis, and that these are mutual decisions, at this point, given what Lucci knows about these players.
By the way, Andy Thomas corrected me very well in his most recent comment. Gregush actually was through the reentry process, so I apologize. It has been much, much, much more recent.
I thought there was a player last year. I wasn't going to correct you, but by the way, Crystal says that stage 1 reentry is tomorrow. Stage 2 is 11/22. So if you're looking for excitement ahead of the World Cup, don't miss the stage 1 reentry draft tomorrow, in which probably only 2 teams will do anything.
And by the way, Francisco Calvo, of course, is the free agent. But as I said, I think that's a slightly more likely mechanism to find a bigger player.
Trevor, I think, beat Andy.
Trevor beat Andy in this correction. My bad.
Very good. Sorry, Trevor. We didn't mean to slight you there. Okay, let me back up just a little bit here. Yeah, you got another thing you want to point out?
I have a little bit of a depth chart. A little depth chart that I like to operate here This is assuming, roughly speaking, a 4-2-3-1 formation, because of course in soccer there's not a rigid depth chart the way there are in certain sports, because the positions can be more fluid and the tactics more fluid. But generally, I like to construct a team where there's a first choice at every position, a second choice at every position, and then perhaps some developmental options as well. So again, apologize if this is incredibly small. I will try to zoom. No, I don't think I can zoom this in a meaningful way. But basically, if you're looking through the first team, most of these positions have, in my opinion, a relatively strong starting potential. There's places they could absolutely improve. Cade Cowell, if he doesn't develop, the left wing position is, I think, a place to make a major upgrade, etc. But most of these positions, you have at least a decent starting level player. The huge gap is one of those two pivot midfielders. Again, maybe it's a 4-3-3, maybe it's a 4-2-3-1, but basically a deep lying central midfielder next to Jackson Ewell. Right now, Jackson Ewell is the only guy under contract who's truly a center midfielder on the entire club. And there's guys like Cruz Medina, who's probably a central midfielder. Will Richmond has played there. Jack Skane has played there. But if you're talking like real MLS level starting potential players with central midfield experience, it's just Jackson Ewell. And all other teams typically carry about 4 of those types of players, potentially more. depending on the tactics they play. So if you notice here, I have green places where I think that they'll make an acquisition, and these two yellows are Tommy Thompson and Judson, who could fill in some kind of the gaps, I suppose, for those second team players. So I think that they could go for a second team goalkeeper. They certainly need to have two backup central midfielders, one of whom may be Judson. For right back and left back, they currently only have Paul Marie backing up the two that they have. Tommy Thompson would add one. Jack Skane, if he moves over there, would have one. Jack Skane could be a winger like he was in college. Who knows? But this one right here, that starting level central midfielder in a deeper role, that is the big glaring gap. I think and people in the chat have mentioned this as well. Jamon, you and I have certainly talked about what a defensive midfielder would do for this team. And, I think that both of us talking to people in the club, they see it the same way as well. They know that's a major position. And by the way, they just ditched all of their central midfielders. Grey Goose, Remedi, and Judson all went off contract. So they clearly were not happy with their options. I would expect them to make a big move for a starting level player, somebody to be, a real, like a needle mover. And then they're probably going to have to get another one as well for strong cover.
I think that's why they're negotiating with Judson, because I think they see him in that second spot if they can get the right contract. I think that's the trick.
Okay. And Judson, by the way, domestic player, just for those of you keeping track at home.
Some comments in here. Satish says $2 million off the books is great. We could get 3 solid proven players for that money. Ben says great to catch this live again. We agree. We're happy to do a show. But if you didn't catch it, definitely catch my conversation with Tudor Rahman, the VP of marketing for the Earthquakes. It was a combination of mainly talking about the U.S. men's national team. And Toodle's been an expert covering the U.S. men's national team on Twitter for a long time. Whatever you think about, we're good at in terms of Quakes coverage, Tudor provided that for many years for the men's national team, and covered the men's national team as well as we cover the Quakes, I believe. And he's now the VP of marketing for the Earthquakes. He's also responsible for the watch parties. So the whole San Pedro Square setup and everything like that, he's actually responsible for it. So he answered, I think, 10 different questions that people had posted in the Slack, took all of them and talked about each player on the men's national team. If you missed that, catch up with that as well. So to give you some more content from Quakes Epicenter and ahead of the World Cup there with some Quakes bent to it, I would say. David says, we're playing checkers in a league where everyone is playing chess. I think that gap is closing. And then particularly, I think in terms of roster construction, that gap is starting to close. Is it possible that at the top end of some of the rosters, in the league, we're still not going to see that expenditure from the Quakes? So, I think that's likely still. Okay, let's see. Leach doesn't get enough credit. How's our front office spending compared to other teams? I mean, Colin, it's what, it's 3 or 4 from the bottom right now, but we're talking like small margins below and above.
Yeah, well, I interpreted Argy's question. I interpreted Argy's question was kind of as referring to the front office staffing and the other stuff, which is what I was mentioning earlier. Is that they really have invested in the analytics. It's probably not the top spending front office, but they're moving in that direction. But yeah, I actually there's kind of an ongoing discussion in the most recent comments about how to value a defensive midfielder and whether or not a designated player would be worth it. There's a couple different ones. There's Andy's talking about it, Lance is talking about it. I just wanted to weigh in. I think so. First of all, when we say we use the term defensive midfielder, we're really kind of referring to a potentially very large collection of different types of players and roles, because it's not just one role that's filled in one way. There's the classic, just kind of, Fatai Alashe is like one type of defensive midfielder, right? But at the highest level, defensive midfielders are the guys who, make or break sides. If you talk back in the day at Real Madrid, Claude Makelele was like the least famous player on the team, but all of the Galacticos that were around him were like, Makelele is the reason that we can play the way that we do. He is the guy who allows everything. Tottenham in recent years, Moussa Dembele was regarded by all of his peers and all of his teammates as a radical genius who was essential to Mauricio Pochettino's sides, but he was by far not the most famous player on the team. N'Golo Kante rightly has been given the kind of consideration that he deserves over recent years for his ability to influence a game. I think that this position is highly valuable if it's the right guy. And I think the distinction between 8s and 6s and those kinds of things is perhaps an overwrought distinction. And we can even use examples within this league here of MLS of really high level players who were on large contracts who made the difference between good and great teams. João Paulo at Seattle has been incredibly important. Victor Wanyama at Montreal has been incredibly influential in their rise. And obviously, Eduardo Atuesta for LAFC was a genius and hugely valuable to them. And they haven't, obviously they've now won MLS Cup, but they struggled to replace him for quite a long time. So I think that this is a very valuable position, and it's worth an investment. That doesn't necessarily mean DP investment, by the way. It could be a TAM player, from within the league where you're paying a large GAM fee to get them acquired or whatever it may be. But I definitely think that this is a very worthwhile position to invest in. And if you look at last year, that was the hugest tactical issue for them being able to manage the rest of the game. So don't have a narrow mind about what a defensive midfielder looks like, but those influential central midfielders, they run games, and that you don't always notice them doing so, but they're really essential.
I think one of the things too with the right defensive midfielder, you could get more opportunities to be able to play, Montero along with Shakiris and keep Shakiris going with that development while not giving up the type of ground that a Jamiro Montero covers. I thought it was a lot of fun toward the end of the season when we got to see the two of them together. And one of the things about Montero that a lot of people don't realize is that from a production perspective, in terms of XG, XA, goals and assists, real goals and real assists, he's actually toward the bottom of cams of the attacking midfielders in the league. He's not toward the top of that list. He brings a lot of other value. I think we would all agree that he's the up and down the MVP of the team from last season. A lot of other value he brings, but not all of that is in creating, offensive production. So it does feel like, the team needs to have those kinds of creators. It can be from the wings, a la Christian Espinoza, or it could be someone else beside him in the midfield that he can work along with, but that's probably not going to be your 6. It's probably going to be an 8, a double 10. Shakiris potentially can fit that, but also so could, a new TAM player, a new designated player could fit into those spots as well. Ryan with a good question here. Do you think Leach will make another big intra-league move this offseason like he did with Jibo and Montero? And if so, is there anyone you think he should get? And I think that's where some of the names that came up about free agency came up, the Ola Kamara, Daniel Shalloway, that's a really interesting name right there if you can get him. What do you think?
The attacking options are always more fun to consider, but you kind of have to weigh their value very carefully, and you also have to make sure that they tactically fit in. Ola Kamara, I think, is a nice player, but at this stage in his career, there's a reason that he was let go. The reason that these guys end up on the list is that the clubs that had them decided to let them go. And that's usually a sign right there. So I think that, Daniel Shalloway, talented player, but, it's like, why is it that he was let go? Can you get him at a reasonable price? And can you fit him into your lineup in a way that doesn't block the development of the players you want to develop, like a Benji and like a Cade, and, actually makes the team better? So for me, none of those tactical options are kind of fun, to consider. I remember when Maxi Rudy was on the re-entry draft one year. I was like, oh, this is pretty exciting. We could get Maxi Rudy. But you have to really make sure you know what you're getting. So I'm not a huge fan of that. That being said, the trade stuff absolutely is interesting to me. I know that they're very active at scouting the league, and they're hunting all the time for these deals. I think that I probably annoy the front office people that I talk to by proposing too many intra-league trades and saying, I like this guy, you should go get him. How much do you think he would cost? So yeah, I know that it's something that they consider very, very richly. I'm not saying this is a report, by the way, but Eric Williamson in Portland is somebody that I just like the fit on paper of what he could bring into a midfield with Montero and Yule and him together. I think there's different ways you could shape that into something that makes sense. But Williamson is a 6 and Yule as kind of an 8 and Montero is a 10 in front of him. That's something I can imagine working. The problem, quite frank, and by the way, he has a good relationship with Jeremy Abobasi. Apparently they're close from their time in Portland together. The problem is I actually think that the Quakes might just get outbid here. And remember that they have to use GAM in order to execute this transaction since it's within the league. And so it's not necessarily a matter of John Fisher being willing to spend more money. They actually need to have GAM to spend. And that GAM comes from these league allocations. So I think that's a tough one. And they may get outbid by one of those clubs that has been selling guys abroad for a long time and has this big fat stack of GAM that we don't. But he would be a really nice fit. And I'm just telling you, they are looking at a lot of guys. I really like Russell Knaus for DC. Different kind of fit. I don't think he would be a transformational midfielder, but he is somebody who'd be a very solid defensive midfielder who would really dig into the defensive work to free up Jackson. Something like a Judson role from 2019. But he's also coming off a serious injury and doesn't necessarily have the other elements of his game to complement. But yeah, the front office is absolutely tightly focused on the domestic market. I think that a trade is very much a possibility.
Okay.
They're also looking abroad too, by the way. And I got the sense that they have a pretty clear perspective of what they're looking for in this role that we've been talking about.
Yeah, it's really easy to throw out, player names because those seem like attractive players or players that and maybe have played well against the Quakes or have good numbers. That doesn't necessarily mean that they feel that a player is going to be a fit. So as you can see from the way that St. Louis City did their expansion draft the other night, there's some really attractive players that they could have gone out and picked up. Instead, they went for value players. They were looking for players that could come in and make a big contribution, potentially a big contribution, but not necessarily the players that are the most expensive, because a lot of this is managing that cap and the secondary the supplemental roster area pretty well, your homegrowns pretty well, really taking advantage of all the mechanisms that MLS has. I mean, a few years ago, when Nashville started off, they drafted like 6 defensive midfielders, across many different teams. And everyone's like, it was kind of crazy talk. Well, Nashville still feels the effects of that because it's a team that plays decent defense, but they couldn't score. They couldn't hit the broadside of a barn when it came down to time in the playoffs. So these things do matter, and how teams construct their rosters from the beginning seems to kind of stick with them for a few years. Minnesota United was in the same position. The benefits that Atlanta United and LAFC got out of that initial pickup of players, they felt, for 2 to 3 years. And so, it is important to make sure that the roster construction end of this, is done right. Lance makes a good point here. We need another player to compete with Jeremy and give him a bit of a break. I did feel that, particularly coming off of a season where he had suffered that head injury, there was almost a bit too much dependency. I know that at any time Benji Kikanovic can play the 9, and probably would really enjoy to play the 9, to be quite honest. But it does feel that that's kind of getting by a little bit on the cheap, I would say, to take Benji away from the wing and put him at the 9. And I guess you can put Kate on the wing, and you can make it work, but it feels like it would be better if Jeremy was getting pushed by somebody who could actually also start. It's maybe a value player, but someone with some upside potential. Anything that you think could be happening in that particular department, Colin?
I mean, I've been loud about this for a long time. I think that the real solution is to have somebody establish themselves at left wing who's very, very high level. So for example, you sell on Cade and you put a DP in that spot. And then Benji Kikanovic is your backup 9. And becomes an incentive to rotate them quite a bit more because I agree strongly that Jeremy cannot, proceed at this level. Assuming it's not coming in there, yeah, I probably would get a backup forward other than Benji so that they have more different options up top. But, most teams like having 2-3 strikers, even if they only use 1 striker formations. Jeremy was way overused. It was very rarely substituted out. It's a very physical position that they need to do something else. And in my opinion, Benji Kikanovic's skill set is most dangerous when he gets to be able to run into the box and finish there. So I would like to see him get more opportunities in that role. Obviously, something's going to have to give. Someone's going to be losing out on playing time, either at left wing or at the 9. But that's kind of my preferred solution.
Okay.
By the way, could I just mention like a totally off the wall theory here? So the full official free agent list hasn't come out yet. By the way, I think that the MLSPA released the free agency eligible list over the summer. Do I have that right? Or
I think that's right.
Okay, so
all these
we will
lists
find
start
out.
to run together for me.
Yeah, so I could have this wrong. I apologize if I do, but my impression is that the eligible list, of course, is not necessarily the guys who are necessarily coming out into MLS free agency. You know, Anton Tinnerholm, for example, left New York City FC and has already announced that he's going to be, signing in Sweden. So, once we get the final list of eligible free agents, we can view it more. Totally off the wall theory. Kendall McIntosh was the backup keeper in Sporting Kansas City. He actually is a San Jose Earthquakes academy guy from way back in the day. Maybe that's the backup option that they have in mind to bring home instead of Matt Bersano. I would imagine that Leach would still have some connection with him given his time at the academy when McIntosh was there.
That's a good point. Okay. I'm trying to just go back through and see if we got everyone's questions. If I think Lance might have another good question here. I'm not sure if we got to it or not. DPs don't count on the cap number right, so we could get a nice DP hopefully. So let's do this. Can you bring the spreadsheet back up? And I want to again walk people through how designated players work from a structural perspective.
Yep.
And like who is an eligible DP. I mean, it's not necessarily who fans I think would want to be DPs, but there are many players who are eligible, but then our TAM is used so that they are not going to be DP players. So I'm going to pull the spreadsheet back up here.
Yeah. So hopefully you can see the things that I've highlighted on the screen are these two rows here. You see Jamiro Montero and Christian Espinosa. Those are the two current designated players for the San Jose Earthquakes. Teams are limited to 3 total designated players. And they're actually, I guess there's no hard limit on TAM players, but there's a practical limit just because of the budget constraints. The important thing about DPs is it's not that they don't have any budget charge, it's that they have a very specific budget charge. And last year that was $612,500. This year it will be up very, very slightly on that. And that's referred to as the maximum budget charge. And everything over that, either coming from their salary, coming from bonuses, coming from the transfer fee that was paid. So Christian Espinosa, we know, for example, was roughly $2.5 million in transfer fee. All of those budget charges that are amortized, none of that applies beyond that charge of $612,500. So basically you get 3 players that that's their charge, no matter how much you're paying them. It could be $100 million. It could be Lionel Messi will hit the MLS budget charge at this exact amount if he comes to the league, for example. So that's the kind of the unique flavor of a designated player is it's anybody over that. And by the way, that maximum charge is actually lower if you're signing a very young player. So if it's a 21-year-old, it actually hits at a lower level, and that's to incentivize teams to sign these kind of younger players that can be sold on. The TAM players are a little bit more complicated. I don't have them specifically flagged here on this sheet, but you can see guys like Jeremy Abobasi, Jackson Ewell, Nathan are all guys that use TAM. What you notice is their total compensation and their cap hits are above this quote unquote maximum budget charge. What that means is the gap between this cap hit and the maximum budget charge has to be bought down with TAM. Technically, it can actually be bought down all the way down to 150 grand of a budget charge if you want to save more quote unquote hard dollars. But
and there's a maximum salary number also at which TAM can be applied.
Yeah, so it's anyone where the budget charge is 1.5 or 1.6 million and below. So basically, it's about $1 million above the maximum charge. That's the kind of the range that you can do. So you'll notice Jamiro Montero and Christian Espinosa here. If it was just their salaries, which for Montero it is, for Espinosa he also has the transfer fee. They could be TAM players for a different club. If they were transferred to Toronto FC, Christian Espinosa could be a TAM player. Because he is still within, or Montero could be a TAM player because he's within that kind of threshold. But for the San Jose Earthquakes, they would rather have this single charge at $612,500 than use TAM to bring them all the way down, and then spread that TAM instead over at other players. So typically, designated players are just the 2 or 3 the most expensive players at the club, and to kind of minimize their budgeting. And that's usually the way it's to do. There occasionally are times when they will put somebody as a designated player who is not their most expensive player. There's just some weird accounting reasons for why that might make sense.
Okay. Yeah, because I think they did that with Showfeast, and a lot of people were like, Showfeast shouldn't be a designated player, but it was more of an accounting thing than anything else, and probably had to do with the loan situation and maybe some things that we're not even able to track because they're not made public to us.
Yeah. Can you highlight Crystal's question, by the way? There's
Sure.
This is a wonky issue.
Last question?
Indeed. So this is a good and very complicated question. I should put the caveat that I do not know if the new CBA that they renegotiated has changed this. The old CBA said that to have a third designated player slot, you had to buy it from the league for 150 grand in GAM, as she describes. The one additional thing that's interesting is all the clubs that don't buy that third slot actually share the pot of those entry fees. So basically, it's like a luxury tax. So the way that the luxury tax works in the NBA is like, if you're in the luxury tax, you pay the fee, and everyone who's not in the luxury tax kind of divvies up the remaining fees. So
because the Quakes, if they only have 2 designated players, they could be getting some fees.
Correct.
From not using that third slot. But how much? So again, how much does the U22 initiative, right? The U22 initiative also has an impact toward a designated player slot if you have 3 players who are.
I don't remember the threshold
program.
I don't remember the threshold. I think it's more than 3. The Quakes, though, are not there.
I thought when you hit 3 players, it takes up a DP slot, and so there's basically a max of 3. But
you're going beyond.
This is really deep into capology here. But the one thing to mention is that Marcos Lopez was in that spot and is no longer in that spot.
Yeah, so the Quakes only have 1.
Provide some flexibility in terms of another player who the Quakes want to pay more money to. That would be, young enough to be able to apply that to.
Yep. So we only have 1 U22 player right now. They could easily put 2 more without jeopardizing it. I would have to go back to look at the specific rules.
Okay. Yeah, I think it's.
But yeah, I just want to reemphasize for everybody.
You have 3 of those players.
Yeah, so I just want to reemphasize for everybody because it comes up all the time. Designated player is an accounting distinction. It does not necessarily mean the best player on your team, and not all designated players are created equal. There's TAM players who make more money than our designated players at different clubs because they've just managed their rosters differently.
So Lance says a lot of these TAM guys are possible DPs. Hopefully,
every TAM player.
Every TAM player. So, I mean, the question is, who is in your roster and what makes the most sense for you in order to be able to get the cap structure that you want. As Colin, you pointed out, usually it's going to happen with the more expensive player, but you could have, for instance, that 2.5 million transfer fee that was reported for Espinoza having to be amortized, over a few years. Transfer fees and other things can kind of mess up your cap structure and force you to make decisions where you may have to spend a bunch of money to buy down a player like Jamiro Montero out of your TAM. And now that TAM is not available for other players that would fit into that TAM range. Yep. And this is one way that teams, when they overspend on designated players, can actually mess up future years. So for instance, some of these expenditures that are happening in LAFC, Toronto FC, to name a couple, they could be mortgaging the future in effect with some of those decisions because, they're going to need to amortize some of those things across. In fact, it was already reported that Toronto FC's already had one departure out of the players that they've signed. And it's been reported kind of under the covers that couple of the new players that came in, Bernadeschi is not very happy, and as well as another player or two. So, that could really set Toronto FC back from a cap perspective if they can't really kind of resolve, some of those situations in a way that's amicable to them and their contracts. So might have sounded great to bring in a bunch of Italians, but you might pay the price for it for the next 2-3 years, and it might really mess up your ability to do certain types of transactions. Okay. Really interesting stuff. I told people in the Slack this was going to be like the geekiest show of the year, Colin. I think we delivered on that. Any final thoughts that you want to get across before we take off tonight?
No. Well, all right. Sorry. I lied. You gave me an opportunity to speak. I will take it.
This is your chance to like go as geeky as you want to go. Like if 28 people are still sticking around to hear us geek out over this type of stuff, I mean, they're game for it.
Yeah. So look, the simple thing is, I think largely every transaction that Chris Leach and his team have done is most of them have been pretty good. The things that he has done, but I want to emphasize that doesn't reflect the things he could have done that he didn't do. And that's kind of what this offseason is he's cleared the deck and made some space to make some major moves. Last summer, I think that the individual decision to sell Marcos Lopez makes sense. The individual decision to sell Francisco Calvo makes sense. But, it left the team without a lot of options. They eventually backfilled some of those things. And some players like Akapo weren't healthy, and therefore we never saw them. Rodriguez was, for me, a little bit of a stretch, and I don't know if he's going to come good in the league. We'll find out. But, these decisions might be individually defensible, but when you zoom out and you look at the collective picture, the GM's job is to put together a winning team on the field. And that's this offseason. They have the space and room to maneuver. They have a new coach who's going to be more competent than the old coach and certainly going to run a different system. What we'll see here is my challenge to this front office is, be proactive and aggressive to fill the gaps that you need to fill, to get better at the positions where you can, to seize those opportunities. Basically, you can make all the right decisions individually for the things you do, but not move the team forward. And I think that next step is what this offseason is about, is you can't just make good individual decisions. You have to make sure that you're moving the whole team forward.
All right, Colin, heading toward midnight on the East Coast. Really appreciate you taking the time and the patience to walk us through all this tonight. Make sure, of course, that you thank Colin. At Quakes Epicenter is where a lot of the tweets that come out of Quakes Epicenter are coming from Colin. Of course, you can follow me at JMoreQuakes. I want to thank everyone for spending the time with us tonight. We really appreciate it getting to have all of you aboard and do a live audience again. If you appreciate what we do, I know most of you are patrons, but definitely consider joining as a patron. In the off season, we tend to lose patrons, and we have to work hard to start to get them back as the season starts up again. If you are a patron, thank you for continuing with us. If you've dropped off, consider picking us back up as soon as you can, maybe at the start of the season if you want to wait till then. But know that we're going to try to deliver as much content for you in this off season as possible. Okay, so for Colin, I'm Jamon. Thanks, everyone. Have a really good rest of your evening, and go Quakes.